Good evening. Well, we're here to celebrate, I think, Charlie's book, Americans in Paris, Life and Death Under Nazi Occupation, 1940 to 1944. I think the obvious question to start with is simply, why did you happen on this subject, or how did you happen on this subject? Because it's an unexplored one. There have been memoirs of Paris, Americans in Paris in the 20s and the 30s, in the 50s, and the late 40s, when people like Richard Wright and James Baldwin were going there. But this is an unexplored subject, so how did you come to do it?
Well, I was lucky in that I found the one thing about World War II that hadn't been written, so I could plug that tiny hole. Also, when I was living in Paris, trying to think of a book to write that would keep me in Paris, because the main goal was to stay on. This was kind of an obvious one because I am American and I love Paris, and I wanted to do something that kind of combined the two. And I used to see all of those, and I wrote about this in the introduction, war memorials, particularly one in the Place Saint-Michel, to the people who lived in Paris, and some of whom died in Paris fighting the occupation. And wondering, because of all, and you write about this in your novel, A Question of Loyalties, all of the complications of the Vichy years and of the occupation. It wasn't as black and white as film subsequently portrayed it. But I wondered, I couldn't really decide what I'd have done if I'd stayed on in Paris at that time as a Frenchman, but I could if I'd been an American. And then I thought, well, there must have been Americans here. There was a huge American community before the war.
How many?
Before the war, about 30,000. But another 3,000 to 5,000 stayed on. And so I thought, well, what did they do? And the more I dug into the archives, the more fascinating it became. And I said, there's a book in here. And actually, there are probably several books. And I left out more than I put in. I mean, I narrowed it down to 4 main characters. But you could do the same book again with any number of, any 100 people there. It's a very rich vein.
Curious situation of them at the beginning of the war was that they were neutrals.
So they weren't touched. I mean, when the Germans came in, they were actually protected. The U.S. Embassy issued several thousand sort of red, what do you call them, stickers that you put on the house or your business to say it was American owned, and then the Germans didn't touch it. And they were, then since the Germans didn't want to antagonize the United States and bring it into the war, they left them alone. It wasn't until Pearl Harbor that they officially, when Germany declared war on the United States, rather foolishly as it turned out, when they declared war on the United States, that they became enemy aliens. But even then, from December of 1941 until September of 1942, they still weren't touched. They weren't interned, they weren't bothered. They had to report to the local prefectural police once a week, and that was it. But in September of 42, the United States began arresting German citizens in the United States, and the Germans retaliated then by interning Americans in all German-occupied Europe. And it was then that most of them were taken to, either the men to Compiègne or the women to Vitel.
In the beginning, where you have the American hospital and the American library are central in the book. Should you tell us something about them?
Okay, well, these two institutions were the major American institutions, along with the American church at the American Cathedral in the Avenue Georges V, and the American church, the Low Church in the Quai d'Orsay, were the 4 main American institutions in Paris. And the hospital had started at the turn of the century and became very important in the First World War, treating American soldiers in 1917, 1918 who had been wounded, and was an important institution because Americans could be treated there for free. And it was run ultimately by a man called General Count Aldebert de Chambrun, whose wife was running the American Library, Countess de Chambrun. And his wife was an American whose brother, Nicholas Longworth, was the Speaker of the House of Representatives of the United States. And Longworth had married Teddy Roosevelt's daughter, Alice. So Clara was related to Franklin Roosevelt, then president, by marriage, and her son, Rene, was related to Franklin by blood. And and Alice Roosevelt, who was still very active in Republican Party politics, was his aunt. And it was Renee who went off to the United States during the Battle of France to plead with Roosevelt to send weapons to help the French to resist, and when the French were collapsing, then to send those weapons instead to Britain. And he was very persuasive. In fact, he persuaded the Senate Foreign Relations Committee to change its mind about providing aid to Britain. And at the time, was regarded by the British as a great hero. Subsequently, the British disowned him.
The different shades of Vichy and the fact that it's extremely difficult to say where patriotism ends and
treason begins.
And treason begins.
Yeah. No, I mean, and also many Vichy ministers who stayed on in the early stages of Vichy subsequently went over to de Gaulle without much difficulty. Others, because of certain things that they did in terms of executing resistance people and so forth, they couldn't make that transition,
yes.
weren't allowed to. But some who had cooperated very early on with Pétain were welcomed by the Gaullists when the Americans and the British invaded North Africa, took over French North Africa.
Yes.
You know, by the way, the United States never severed relations with Vichy.
Yeah.
There was diplomatic relationship between Washington and Vichy throughout the war, which the British objected to. Although the British themselves did not sever relations with Vichy, Vichy severed relations with the British. After the British bombed the fleet at Moselle-Kabir, the French fleet at Moselle-Kabir, the British were forced out because the French were furious about it.
I mean, the key moment for Vichy is surely when the Germans move into the occupied zone after Operation Torch and the Allied yes. landings in North Africa, and people around Pétain urge him to go to North Africa.
Yes.
And he says, no, I promised the French I would stay with them.
He said he was the shield between yes. the German occupation and the French people. And the example that he used was the occupation of Lorraine.
Yes.
1870 to 1918, when the French population was forced out and humiliated. And he said that because there was no French administration there yes. to protect them, he would be the protection yes. that the French people needed. No one bought that after the war, clearly. I mean,
no one bought it much after 1942, no. November 1942 either.
In fact, his cooperation with the Germans once they occupied Vichy was what enabled the French officers in North Africa to violate their oath to him, because yes. they'd taken a personal oath to him, because he was now seen as a prisoner of the Germans.
Yes.
And so they could very easily then come over to the yes. Allies, and they did.
But if he had gone to North Africa,
it would have been a problem for de Gaulle.
Well, I mean, what de Gaulle actually said was if he'd gone to North Africa, the Americans would have greeted him with open arms, he'd have been a man on the white horse,
yes.
and us, we'd have been fucked.
And it's true, because Roosevelt yes. didn't like de Gaulle anyway.